Thanks for introduction. Absolutely. But yes, again, as a formality, I'll just very briefly introduce Professor Rosinka Chaudhuri, who we all know is the director here, and the Professor of Cultural Studies at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences. She was the inaugural Mellon Professor of the Global South at Oxford University, 2017-18, and has held visiting positions at King's College London, Delhi University, Cambridge University, and Columbia. Her books include Gentlemen Poets in Colonial Bengal, Emergent Nationalism and the Orientalist Project, 2002, Freedom and Beefsteaks, Colonial Calcutta Culture, 2012, and The Literary Thing, History, Poetry, and the Making of a Modern Cultural Sphere, 2013. She has edited Derozio, Poet of India, a definitive edition, 2008, The Indian Post-Colonial, 2010, A History of Indian Poetry in English, 2016, An Acre of Green Grass and Other English Writings of Buddhadev Ghosh, 2018, and a series titled Social Science Across Disciplines, co-edited with Partho Chatterjee in 2019. Most recently, she has edited, annotated, and introduced George Orwell's Burmese Days for Oxford World's Classics as part of their Orwell series, 2021. Many articles, reviews, and book chapters have been published nationally and internationally, while her translation of Rabindranath Tagore's letters, titled Letters from a Young Poet, 1887-94, received an honorable mention in the category A.K. Ramanujan Prize for Translation, South Asia, at the Association for Asian Studies Book Prizes 2016. Over to you, Rosinka.
Thank you so much, Devdatta. You've read out the entire text on the website.
Yes, I did.
Thank you for that introduction. So this talk is extracted from a book project that unbelievably, certainly unbelievably to me, seems to have reached a conclusion after almost 10 years of unending research. Titled Young Bengal and the Making of the Modern Indian, for now, I have ventured to do in it what has not been attempted to date by historians, write a book on the phenomenon familiar to most Bengalis, but not to very many other Indians perhaps, called Young Bengal. In the process, I've often been reminded of the popular saying, fools rush in where angels fear to tread, as it has been an incredibly difficult task in many ways, from gathering new archival material to organizing that material into a coherent narrative. This presentation is part of chapter 3. In the book, it's titled, at the moment, Liberty, Freedom of Speech, and the Principle of Equal Justice. The first section is called A Den of Treason. At a meeting of the Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge, held in the hall of the Sanskrit College on 8 February 1843, around 150 Indians assembled one evening to hear Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee read an essay titled The Present State of the East India Company's Criminal Judicature and Police under the Bengal Presidency. Gautam Chattopadhyay, the only scholar to have worked extensively on the Young Bengal archives, felt that this meeting of the SAGK constitutes a landmark not only in the history of that association, but also in the history of social and political awakening in Bengal in the early 19th century, unquote. All of Young Bengal, which for the purposes of this book encompasses only the first batch who graduated under Derozio, would have been expected to be present in the hall, except probably Radhanath Chigdar, who may have been stationed at Dehradun at the time. I haven't actually gone into the trouble of searching the archives to see if he was here or not. Certainly, he didn't make any interventions at the meeting. Tarachand Chakraborty, president of the SAGK, was in the chair that evening. Apart from the many Indians and some Europeans in attendance, the principal of the Hindu College, D.L. Richardson, was also present, although as a guest rather than a member. Only half of the essay could be read out, however, when there was an interruption in the proceedings, such as had never been witnessed in the city before. Purkara printed an extensive report on the sensational developments that followed, as well as reproduced the speech given by Dakshinaranjan that day, verbatim from the manuscript, as they said, in two parts. Much in the manner of the essay on the colonization of India of 1830, which too had generated heated discussion in the press and which I have discussed elsewhere. This essay also had the same broad style, a convention of essay writing at the time, no doubt, of presenting an overview of the subject at the start. We see that the talk began by addressing friends and countrymen, presenting at first a sweeping and general historical overview of how men, once emerged from barbarism, had gone about the business of establishing, quote, a system for the security of property and the protection of each individual member of society, unquote. Every civilized society, it was declared, had developed codes. And in India, quote, the laws of Manu and Jaggobolpo were referred to as, quote, codes that evidenced an anxiety for the welfare of the people. So I'll just restart from where I left off. Every civilized society, it was declared, had developed codes. And in India, the laws of Manu and Jaggobolpo were referred to as codes that evidenced an anxiety for the welfare of the people. However, their efficacy had been impaired by the arts of priestcraft and the tyranny of conquerors. Even if in earlier times, the sovereign lord, Dakshinaranjan said, had exercised a patriarchal sway and so could abuse their power, the principle of governing for the good of the many, though less vigorously alive, was never lost sight of from the moment that called it into being. In successive generations, all quarters of the globe had added to this concept. And as mankind grew more enlightened, popular rights recognized, indeed, but often placed at the mercy of the ruling authority, were better understood, more strictly developed, more strikingly illustrated, and more successfully defended. At this day, he went on, the principle of equal justice in the administration of government is universally received and almost universally admitted, at least in theory and profession, if not in actual practice. Governments, he reminded his audience, are for the good of the many and not of the few. We see the phrase popular rights being used here, perhaps for the first time in Indian national discourse, an event of no mean significance, even if the speaker recognizes that it was a concept more extant in theory and profession, words that appeared in italics in the report the next day, as indeed did the words equal justice. Complaints about the nature and operation of colonial law in relation to the principles of equal justice had been growing in India at this time, Dakshinaranjan pointed out. Counting from Plassey onward, the British had now been in this part of the country for 80 years, time enough to establish a just judicial and police administration upon the people. That, however, had not been done. A detailed indictment of the state of affairs in the criminal courts of Bengal, the Faujdari Adalat, where the courts were notoriously and shamelessly corrupt, followed. It cannot be denied, he said, that every man in these courts of the Faujdari Adalat had his price, from the peon up to the sheristadar, further maintaining the entire process was one of extortion and corruption in which the weaker and poorer parties invariably went to the wall. It would be at once erroneous and unfair to deny that the lives and property of the natives of India were safer under the East India Company's government than under the rule of their predecessors. But it would at the same time be flattery and an untruth to say that the present system of police was one in which the natives could repose the least confidence. Taking from here to the character of the Hindu people, their tolerance, their willingness to give shelter to other persecuted people such as the Parsis, Dakshinaranjan had just embarked on the motives which had influenced the British coming to these shores when he was interrupted. Captain Richardson had risen to make an objection, and he now took center stage to deliver a lengthy address, objecting strenuously to the tone and tenor of the proceedings. He expressed paternalistic and benevolent feelings to start with at the growing intelligence exhibited by the rising generation among the native population, and pointed out that he himself had always been a sincere advocate of the cause of native education. The British government, he said, had cheerfully lent its assistance to the promotion of an object so desirable, the undeniable proof of which was presented in the college, the hall of which was at that moment occupied by the society. The Hurkadu report then conveys a tone of surprise and injury in Richardson. He regretted, however, to perceive that the spread of intelligence among the young natives had taken a direction and resulted in effects contrary to his expectations. It seemed to have led them to look rather upon the faults than the virtues of the company, and to prefer the contemplation of the dark in preference to the bright side of the picture. This opinion had received strength on the present occasion in consequence of the general sympathy manifested with the remarks that had been made by the young man, referring to Babu Dokhin, and the warm response which those remarks had apparently awakened in the hearts of the audience, a response that seemed to be unanimous. He had been admiring the essay, he said, as a piece of English composition that showed considerable ability. Nevertheless, he could not sufficiently deprecate the tone and spirit in which the writer had conveyed his sentiments, nor the conclusions which had been stated. These, he felt, had been calculated to create discontent. He would remind the meeting of the security the natives now enjoyed in comparison with the condition of their ancestors under the Mohammedan government. The government was well aware, he said, that the universal spread of knowledge among the natives of India would be fatal to the existence of their, that is the government's, power. Nonetheless, they were still doing all in their power to help the cause of education, and hereafter the people might be qualified to govern themselves. No government was perfect, he went on, warming to his theme with many examples. Were those of France or Prussia or Russia any different? No, and perfection was not to be expected. He himself did not expect the present government of India to be perfect. After all, evils existed under the very best forms of government. Did not robberies, violence, and murders occur in Great Britain as well as in India? The abuses of darogas, he thought, was, quote, rather the fault of the people themselves than of the government. Since life and property were so much more secure now than before, the writer should rather have dwelt upon feelings of gratitude, and those around him might also have concurred. Instead, the essay was a catalogue of the defects of our administration and a strong denunciation of the government under which they lived. The real reason why he was so aggrieved, however, was in perceiving the response which such sentiments had found in the bosoms of those present, and he felt it his duty to use every means to discourage such improper conduct. Finally and momentously, he came to the crux of his objection. To stand up in a hall which the government has erected, and in the heart of a city which was the focus of enlightenment, and there to denounce as oppressors and robbers the men who governed the country, did, in his opinion, amount to treason. And though himself a Whig in sentiment, he could not quietly witness such improper proceedings, more especially on the part of those who either were or had been students of the Hindu College, a noble and estimable institution originated with the government that had been so loudly condemned. The college would never have been in existence but for the solicitude the government felt in the mental improvement of the natives of India. He could not permit it, therefore, to be, and this was italicized or emphasized, converted into a den of treason, and must close the doors against all such meetings. DLR, as he was called by his students, had joined the Hindu College to teach English literature 4 or 5 years after Despotism left it, in 1835 or 1836, and had soon established himself as a renowned teacher and accomplished poet himself. You all know famously Macaulay saying that if there was anything he would remember of India, it was Richardson's recitation of Shakespeare. It has been pointed out by a biographer of the poet Madhusudhan Datta, whose idol he was, however, that while Despotism laid an emphasis on reading Locke, Hume, and Paine, in DLR's time they were replaced by Byron, Keats, Shelley, and other romantic poets. Despotism was so much outside the system that an exasperated principal, D. Anselm, had once raised a hand to strike him before David Hare had stepped between the two, while DLR was principal of the college and a figure of authority rather than of free thought for a considerable period. Despotism had earned the distrust of the native managers of the college to the extent that they forced him to resign his job, as you know, in 1831, while DLR had earned their trust to the extent that after he left the country in April 1843, he was brought back to Calcutta by the native managers to rejoin the college at his old post in 1848. Although he describes himself here as a Whig and therefore a liberal in his politics, in relation to India and Indians, we would do well to recall Ishwar Gupta's verses in a poem called Bilate Tory O Whig, written at around this time. We don't have an exact date. Kichu matro nahi jani ram ram kori, kare bole radical, kare bole Tory. Whig kahare bole keba taha jane, Whigger ortho kohu shuni nai kane. Tory আর Whigger যে হন প্রধান আমাদের পক্ষে ভাই সকল সমান যাহাতে দেশের সুখ চিন্তা করি তাই শুধু সুবিচার চাই আমাদের মনে আর অন্য ভাব নাই শুধু সুবিচার চাই so rough approximate translation I don't have any idea o ram ram hori of who is called a radical and who is called a Tory who knows what a Whig is never heard of such a thing meaningless word Whig no one knows what it means whoever is the chief of the Tories and the Whigs for us, brother, it's all the same. All I think of is what benefits my country. It is only justice we ask for, only justice we want. In our minds, there's no other thought. We want justice, that's all. Ishwar Gupta had understood rightly, we can see, that as far as the welfare of Indians was concerned, it mattered little whether an Englishman in India was a Whig, a Tory, or a radical, as that political stance was premised on British affairs and not of much issue with regard to what was best for Indians themselves, as had already been demonstrated on the issue of free trade when the charter was renewed in 1833. Again, I've written about this. At this time, on 8th February 1843, DLR was actually on leave from the college while James Kerr officiated. Meanwhile, his favorite student at the college was preparing surreptitiously to convert to Christianity, which Madhusudhan Datta did on the day following Dakshinaranjan's lecture at the Sanskrit College Hall on the 9th of February 1843. Michael, as he was called from now on, had contacted DLR about 50 times in the following months of March and April for help in returning to the Hindu college, from which he had been expelled upon conversion. But Richardson sailed for England on board a ship called Hindustan at the end of April without that objective being accomplished. What follows this denunciation of Dakshinaranjan's speech by so esteemed a person as the principal of the Hindu college, however, still feels unexpected and astonishing in its unfolding today. Sedition laws were yet to be formulated and would come into existence only by 1870, to be used thereafter as a tool of suppression by the British right till independence. The first case would come to court only in 1891, only to be revived and reincarnated in strength in 21st century India. Instead of the meeting being dispersed and the hall forcibly closed by the authorities, with the police brought in to enforce the orders of those in charge with the help of those in power, the chair, Tarachand Chakraborty, stood up and roundly told off the principal for his conduct. As president of the society and on behalf of my friend Babu Dokhin, I must say, he asserted, that your remarks are anything but becoming. I am bound also to add, he said, that I consider your conduct as an insult to the society, and that if you do not retract what you have said and make due apology, we shall represent the matter to the committee of the Hindu College, and if necessary, to the government itself. We have obtained the use of this public hall by leave applied for and received from the committee, and not through your personal favor. You are only a visitor on this occasion and possess no right to interrupt a member of this society in the utterance of his opinions. I hope that Captain Richardson will see the propriety of offering an apology to my friend, the writer of the essay, and to the meeting. To witness the manner in which any criticism of ruling dispensations in 21st century India, especially by students in their campuses, has been dealt with in the present time, leads to a certain sense of shock and awe in the contemporary reader at the unfolding of events here in the capital of a colonized country in February 1843. Tarachand Chakraborty, who took such a firm stance in his role as president of this SCGK meeting, was well known in his time for his uncompromising standards of self-respect. Orphaned at a young age, he had struggled with poverty from an early age, and Ram Mohan Roy had helped him in every way he could, becoming a close friend and mentor. Tarachand became the first convener of the Brahmo Samaj when it was set up. Pyarichand Mitra wrote a mid-career biographical sketch of Tarachand that was published in the Indian Review in 1840, where it was mentioned that he had joined as a free scholar in the first few months after the Hindu college had been established, leaving it in 1822. This makes it evident that he left 4 years before Desrosiers joined the college. He had then worked for a while at John Silk Buckingham's Calcutta Journal before being appointed under the stewardship of Ram Mohan, translator from English on the staff of the Kaumudi, subsequently working under H.H. Wilson on the translations from the Puranas and other texts appearing in the Bengal Asiatic Society Journal. His interests were obviously wide-ranging. A review of the Assam Boronjoy, signed Tarachand Chakraborty, may be found in the India Gazette of Monday, February 8, 1830. His translation work was also put to use when he joined the School Book Society's Potoldanga School as a teacher at the initiative of David Hare. While he was there, he put together a Bengali English dictionary in 1827 for a remuneration of 700 rupees from the society. He was also known to be a proud man, regardless of circumstance. Leaving a job at Mackintosh and Company in irritation, Birokto hoiya is the phrase Pyarichand used, at the level of self-abasement the English company chief demanded. Perhaps his first encounter with the hollowness of the British judicial system at work in Bengal was when he had been penalized by an English judge on false charges, which then led to his resignation from his job as Munsif at Hooghly, a lucrative post he had no hesitation in giving up. He worked on scholarly projects alongside his managerial positions, contributing to a 5-volume edited and annotated Bengali translation of the Manu Samhita from William Jones's English version, as well as from the original Sanskrit texts. The India Gazette announced the first volume of the Institutes of Menu in 1832, where Tarachand was especially singled out for praise, as he had corrected Jones's mistranslations diligently, and in like manner brought under review the labors of Dr. Carey as lexicographer, remarking on the novelty of seeing these eminent scholars being corrected by an Indian, also for the first time perhaps. In 1838, he had been elected president of the SAGK when it was established. The following year, he had started his own business along with Pyarichand. I have just mentioned these details in order for it to tie in with other parts of the book, where basically we see that this first lot of young Bengal were mostly in favor of independent employment and very reluctant to be employed under the government, although some of them were, of course, employed there, like Shikdar. He had moved itinerantly from job to job, always maintaining the high standards of honesty and integrity, something that might have had a role to play in the strict standards he upheld at the meeting itself as president of the SAGK. Richardson at first refused to either apologize or retract his opinions, and Dakshinaranjan then took the stand again and made his feelings on the matter clear. The chairman was quite right, he felt, and only discharging his duty in calling Richardson to order, as the latter's severe remarks were quite contrary to all the rules of such meetings, seeing the discourse was not half finished. There was no justification for Richardson to have interrupted him in such a way, considering his presence in the hall was only because a member had invited him to come along, and he was just a visitor. The society did not habitually find fault with the British government, Dakshinaranjan continued, quote, unless they were faults of an obvious and injurious character and forced themselves upon their notice. Bestowing the boon of education, as DLR had said, however, could not be, quote, a reason why the faults of the administration should be concealed, and those who had received an education be prevented from exposing errors and pointing out the remedies required. He wasn't comparing the British and Muslim governments, he said, as it was not fair to judge one according to the doings of the other. No, he judged the British nation according to their own religion and professed principles. Refuting Richardson's outrageous suggestion, he also emphatically pointed out that the people of India were in no way answerable for the act of the Darogas, as they were not responsible for placing them in power. Further, the fact that the audience present was sympathizing in the wrongs of their countrymen should surely have rather been a matter of rejoicing. If the people here believed that the people of England wished them not to suffer the many evils they now endure, how then was that disloyalty? Ultimately, Dakshinaranjan also now took a took objection to Richardson's assertion that it was at the government's initiative that the Hindu college had been established. He did not deny that the government had erected the hall where they were assembled of the Sanskrit College, nor that they presently contributed to the support of the Hindu college, whose students were the ones assembled here. That the college itself owed its origin to the government and would have had no existence without it was, he said, contrary to fact. He pointed out that, quote, the college existed long before the government gave it what was its just due, out of the annual lakh of rupees set apart by the British government for national education. Crucially, however, the effort which brought it into existence and its support for many years was wholly independent of government, and therefore greater credit had been claimed for the government than was due. Daksinaranjan could not have had access at this time to the correspondence of Chief Justice Hyde East in 1816, detailing the British reluctance to establish the Hindu College, or known of the persuasion employed by concerned Indians to nudge him and the government to move forward in this regard. His forceful statement on the day would have been based rather on the knowledge that in 1816, the people of Calcutta contributed 1,13,179 rupees towards the Hindu College's establishment, at a time when the annual educational budget for the entire British India was 1 lakh rupees, with David Hare donating the land he owned to the institution. The Hindu College was privately funded by Indian money till 1825, when its funds, invested in a private company called Joseph Barreto and Sons, crashed, and the government stepped in reluctantly with some limited funding. Further, his indignation may also have stemmed from a previous controversy in the city in 1830 regarding a plan implemented by the authorities to have portraits painted of Sir Edward Hyde East and H.H. Wilson as a memorial to their legacy of work on behalf of the country. East's portrait, painted in England and brought to Calcutta in 1830, was accompanied by a plaque that proclaimed him as the original founder and initiator of the Hindu College. College alumni had come together at the time to organize protest meetings, at the end of which they reached a decision to have a portrait of David Hare painted at their own initiative. The letter they sent Hare at the time, 17 February 1831, was printed in the newspapers. It was signed by Daksinaranjan and 564 other young native gentlemen, so that it was recorded for posterity that, however your eminent services to this country may be overlooked by others, they are appreciated by those who have experienced their advantages. Okay, the next section is called absolute liberty under responsibility. That is a phrase within quotes. The most crucial characteristic of the political scene in the capital of the British Empire in India, right up till the Indigo Revolts, all historians have acknowledged, was the undeniable allegiance of all of civil society in Calcutta towards their rulers. Radical or conservative, progressive or orthodox, every citizen at this time, from Rammohn Roy to Ishwar Gupta to Daksinaranjan, understood that they were subjects, equal subjects ideally, but subjects nonetheless. After Rammohn had died in 1833 in distant Bristol while on his mission to meet the highest authorities and indeed the king himself to argue a case for the Emperor of Delhi as well as convey the wants of his countrymen, which some felt he had not done adequately. It was only in the 1840s, however, that a growing awareness was manifesting itself in Bengal. The inhabitants of the city, often in alliance with non-official Europeans as well as Eurasians, began to comprehend the fact that this rule of the East India Company was a different entity from anything they had experienced before, and that the wings and actions of the EIC in Calcutta were not the be-all and end-all of the matter. After the smashing of the company's monopoly through concerted action in the city, that began with the largest meeting at the town hall in Calcutta ever held till then in December 1829, another long jointly fought political battle in the city was for the freedom of the press. This was a campaign conducted for over a decade from the closure of Buckingham's Calcutta Journal and his summary deportation from Calcutta in 1823 onward. A petition remarkable for its joint submission by the Indian and European journalists of Calcutta was submitted to the Governor General in Council on February 6, 1835, asking for a repeal of the Adam regulations that had imposed strict restrictions on the press. Lord Metcalfe, taking over from Bentinck in the same month, managed in the single year he officiated as head of the government to act in accordance with his reported view that the press ought to be free, for which he earned the long-standing gratitude of the city. The magnificent Metcalfe Hall, built mostly with Indian money, still stands tall in his memory to this day to commemorate the moment when the press regulations were repealed. Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee had stood up in the town hall in 1835 on that occasion to declare that, and I quote, "The proposed law is one of the greatest importance to the native community on whose behalf I rise to express my sentiments." Sir Charles Metcalfe certainly deserves all the thanks that we are able to bestow on him. And I concur with Mr. Turton that the liberty we require is not limited, but absolute liberty under responsibility. Let the offender be amenable to the law, and if he deserves punishment, a court of justice is the tribunal to inflict it. The proposed law is well calculated to promote the benefit of the country. For no country so much needs a free press as that whose government is despotic. In asserting that the liberty we require is not limited, but absolute liberty under responsibility, and in his acknowledgement that no country so much needs a free press as that whose government is despotic, we see that his claim for absolute liberty under the law was being made not as a right under a legitimate government, but as a demand despite the despotic nature of the present government under which they functioned. In The Black Hole of Empire, Partho Chatterjee discusses this period in 2 chapters titled Liberty of the Subject and Equality of Subjects, focusing in the first on the early press in Calcutta, showing how John Silk Buckingham's deportation for sedition meant that anti-absolutist demands of the liberty of the subjects of the British Crown quickly found their limits in India, as the government here was, at core, absolutist and authoritarian. The English principles of liberty, based on universal principles of reason, would always have to seek grounds for exception in India, unquote. A brief discussion of Derozio, the mentor of the Young Bengal movement, concludes that his most lasting contribution was in producing the first generation of young Indians schooled in the anti-absolutist spirit of reason and liberty, unquote. The chapter that follows highlights the existence of an unstable and short-lived early modern formation seeking to assert the freedoms of the subject against arbitrary and absolute power, whose protagonists demanded the equality of status of all subjects and the equality of all in their freedoms. One small group of reformist Bengali leaders, he acknowledged, did attempt to use the articulation of the civic associations of mixed membership with the processes of government to make a clearly formulated case of a powerful early modern political idea, the anti-absolutist demand for free and equal citizenship. Following this categorization, however, instead of a more wide-ranging investigation into just what was being asked for and by exactly whom, there is instead a familiar focus on leaders such as Ram Mohan Roy and Dwarkanath Tagore. These are the two that the rest of the chapter is divided into. 8 years after he asked for absolute liberty under responsibility in the context of a free press for India, in the Sanskrit College Hall on 8 February 1843, Dakshinaranjan's articulation of the reasons he felt it his duty to indict the wrongs done to his countrymen by those in power were equally unequivocally expressed. Their object, he said, in exposing existing abuses was to obtain redress from the supreme rulers of the country, who, while ignorant of their nature and extent, could afford them no relief. Here, once again, he was not just taking recourse to, but actually putting in place the political method that would be the dominant mode of redress throughout the 19th century. It was only free discussion and fearless exposure, he said, not silence, that would save the country to the British by leading them to establish justice for all classes. Every fact contained in his essay, he said he was willing to substantiate. And if these constituted, he said, quoting Richardson, a catalogue of crimes, then the fault in that would not be his, but theirs to whom the crimes were attributable. There was no rebellion here. Rather, there was faith in the supreme authority. And it was his duty to point out the defects of those in power who were answerable to those who appointed them. This move in the political rhetoric of young Bengal to the position that if this East India Company government was corrupt and oppressive, then redressal could be sought from the supreme authority was a little less monarchist than it appears to sound. Because, interestingly, and this is the new development in this time, that supreme authority, it seems, did not rest in the person of the King of Britain or the Court of Directors, as it had for Ram Mohan Roy, but resided rather in the body of the people of Britain and public opinion there, which framed the parliament which governed India. And that public opinion could be moved by public opinion and the people in India. Dakshinaranjan said it was his duty to point out the defects of those in power here in India who were answerable to those who appointed them. If to mention the notorious violations of recorded promises on the part of the authorities in India were an offense, surely the violation of public faith itself must be an offense of still greater magnitude, he asked. Every class of people, Dakshinaranjan asserted, needed access to justice under British rule, which the present system denied, leading to the suffering of the poorer classes, most of all. He was reported as going on to say, he was no enemy to British rule, nor to any other rule that was upright and impartial. He would say with Pope, for forms of government let fools contest, whate'er it be best administered is best. These assertions of his, that he was no enemy to British rule so long as it was upright and impartial, accompanied by the appeal to the supreme rulers of the country in whom he had every faith, has been interpreted as a sign of fealty and tribute to the ruling British by embarrassed later historians. Undoubtedly, British rule was perceived by him to be an improvement on the Nawabi era, a sentiment first put in place by Ram Mohan Roy. However, it is my contention that the thinking here has evolved since Ram Mohan's time, and the position taken by young Bengal a little thornier than that professed by Ram Mohan. Investigating the relationship between law, religion, and universality in this period, Rahul Govind has pointed out that Ram Mohan Roy has either been described as the first Indian liberal and a maker of modern India, or as one who could bring about little more than a caricature of promised transformation. That Ram Mohan saw himself as a subject of the English king, however, is much less analyzed. Govind shows that not only did Ram Mohan appeal to George IV as a British subject in his address to the king in council, even in his letter to the heir apparent of the Mughal throne, he made it clear that he was a Mughal envoy only as a British subject. By 1843, however, young Bengal, we can see, had shifted the goalposts incrementally, still appealing as British subjects, but appealing rather to public opinion, which could move Parliament as the final arbiter, rather than to the cabal that was the board of directors of the ERC or to the King of England. The understanding now was that they were equal subjects of the British Empire. Ram Mohan too would have argued that, but not so much under the British monarchy as much more significantly under a parliament that derived its power from the people and could be moved by public opinion. And their objective was to move that public opinion by any means possible. The manner in which young Bengal defended their right to fair treatment in both civil and political matters had shifted significantly. As we can see, not only from the accounts that said that, this is Shashi Chandra Dutt, as a matter of fact, I quote, in courage and boldness also, young Bengal has attained a haughtier caste than had ever been noticed in the cowed servility of their predecessors, unquote, but also self-evidently from incidents such as this, in facing down charges of treason in a remarkable manifestation of fighting spirit that created waves in the public sphere of the capital city of the British Empire in India. What was being argued for at this historical juncture in 1843 was in fact a crucial extension of the long struggle for the freedom of the press in the form of a demand for liberty of expression now. This freedom of expression that was being demanded was for Dakshinaranjan a similar freedom as had been attained for the press in 1835, formulated then by him as a state of absolute liberty under responsibility. Law was the overarching episteme under which this absolute liberty would function. It was envisaged. And what it would entail more broadly was freedom, not just to publish in the printed domain, which had been acquired in 1835, but now the freedom of speech, the right to assemble, to protest, to criticize, and to demand justice. Nowhere was this right to liberty of expression more important, he crucially had pointed out, than in a country whose government was despotic. More independent-minded than both earlier as well as, I think, later subjects of empire in the latter half of the century, Young Bengal's political position constituted demands that were new in that time and needs to be understood not by looking back at them from the present, but by seeing where they stood in relation to what had gone before. Nothing in their experience or in their knowledge of the history of conquered nations, not even developments in distant Latin or North America, would have shown them that the indigenous people of a country or the aborigines of a nation, as a member of Young Bengal had termed them in a speech against colonization in 1830, had overthrown their white conquerors yet anywhere in the world. That they were subjects of the British Empire was not in their minds open to negotiation. What was to be negotiated, rather, were the terms of the contract itself. The repercussions of this incident on 8th February 1843 were felt for some time to come. On the one hand, the subject of Dakshinaranjan's speech, the functioning of the police, was then taken up by George Thompson himself in one of the lengthiest addresses he gave in the city, as well as by G.F.T. Speed and various other members of Young Bengal. On the other hand, in the sphere of the press, the Friend of India, the Eastern Star, and the Englishman exploded in fury at the proceedings as they had been reported in the Hurkadu in the following days. On the 16th of February, 10 days after the meeting, the Friend of India alluded particularly to the declamation of Babu Dakhina Mukherjee, in which he poured the vials of his indignation on this unfortunate government and charged it with having repeatedly violated engagements the most solemn in the very hall which the government had erected for the encouragement of native education. Further, it felt that in any other colonial possession but that of Great Britain, this language would have been punished as seditious. Such a speech at Batavia or Samarang would have ensured the speaker, as the mildest punishment, transportation to Amboina. And not 20 years since, a man would no more have dreamt of uttering such sentiments in Calcutta than he would of engaging in a highway robbery. The best general answer to the objections brought by him against this arbitrary, this perfidious government is the fact that he is allowed to abuse it with such perfect impunity in its own metropolis. The charges Dakshinaranjan had laid out against the judiciary, the police, and the courts also brought forth an attack from the pen of the idler in the Eastern Star. This is James Hume. The Hurkaru, on the other hand, tried to be non-partisan in its approach, defending Young Bengal from the charges of abuse and seditious language, saying it was no worse than some of the rhetoric used by the oldest and most intelligent natives, as well as by the most eminent Europeans unconnected with the government. So they felt such language had been used before. The next section is called Conceptualizing Liberty. Importantly for Indian history, incidents such as the one described above comprised an upheaval in the civic fabric that demonstrated how a manner of speaking and a rhetoric of argument were put in place with regard to methods of political work for the first time in 1843. When Tarachand Chakraborty stood up in the Sanskrit College Hall to rebuke the principal of the Hindu College, a move unilaterally supported by the considerable numbers present there, he was asserting the liberty to speak freely. Conceptual premises of liberty in the 19th century are not generally discussed without recourse to John Stuart Mill's writings. But in relation to these events of 1843, it would be salutary to remember that Mill's reflections on democratic principles and considerations on representative government, 1861, especially in the section on dependencies that referenced India in relation to those principles, were published almost 20 years after the events described here. Preceding that book, liberty of thought and discussion and freedom of association were championed by him in 1859 in On Liberty, when he argued on utilitarian grounds that restrictions on the expression of opinion were never justified, something Dokinaranjan and Tarachand had anticipated him in arguing against D.L. Richardson when they attempted to practice what Mill then preached many years later. Javed Majid in Ungoverned Imaginings, 92, and Lynn Zastupil in John Stuart Mill in India, 94, have discussed the elder and younger Mill respectively, using archival evidence to show how important India was to shaping the flow of British intellectual life through them. The two Mills, Zastupil contends, held on to conventional representations of a primitive India that needed to be remade after the model of an advanced Europe, even if they did not believe the two societies were irremediably different, as all cultures shared common as well as plural human realities like joy, suffering, and political organization. Ramu met him in London and impressed him. The utilitarians were allowed famously to see India as a tabula rasa, blank pages on which to execute their theories, not just by a misreading of the Indian past, and this has been pointed out many times, the misreading of the Indian past, but by a blindness to the India of their own times. More than the past even, it was the Indian present which was in fact a tabula rasa, an empty civil sphere where changes could be effected based on a notion of education which believed society could be remodeled on rational principles. Majid shows this belief to be sourced in James Mill's authoritarianism, elements which were later developed by the younger Mill. John Stuart Mill, following his father in Bentham, had maintained a solidarity throughout for what he saw as the utilitarians' long radical tradition of an almost unbounded confidence in the efficacy of two things, representative government and complete freedom of discussion. He must say, of course, those beliefs held true only for their own enlightened regions, not the colonies. Although Bentinck then brought these beliefs in the 1830s to India in a genuine attempt to marry two irreconcilable despotism and enlightened government. The philosophers young Bengal did read, actually, are mentioned in several accounts. We have already seen that one of these mentioned, Derozio, laid an emphasis on reading Locke, Human Pain, in contrast to D.L.R.'s time, while Alexander Duff famously attested that at the meetings of the Academic Association, this was formed in 1828, predecessor of the SCGP, the sentiments delivered were fortified by oral quotations from English authors. If the subject was historical, Robertson and Gibbon were appealed to. If political, Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham. If scientific, Newton and Davy. If religious, Hume and Thomas Paine. If metaphysical, Locke and Reed, Stewart and Brown. After his dismissal from the Hindu College in April 1831, the India Gazette reported in July that year that Derozio had commenced on a course of evening lectures on metaphysics in, and the next part I couldn't read off the microfilm, of the society school at Potulranga, which are attended by about 150 young gentlemen. So this is July 1831. It follows, therefore, that to understand the philosophical outlook in this period, one should look not so much to the Mills, but to John Locke, Adam Smith, and Jeremy Bentham, side by side with the huge popularity of Paine and Hume, early 19th century liberals who emphasized the emancipatory promise of equality and freedom. John Locke, 1632 to 1704, among the most influential political philosophers of the modern period, was widely read and disseminated amongst the group. Derozio carried them through the pages of Locke, Reed, and Stewart with consummate skill, a biographer recounted, describing an incident in relation to this. I quote, "One day, Ram Gopal, while reading Locke with Derozio, gave expression to a felicitous remark. Locke, he said, had written his Conduct of the Understanding with the head of an old man, but with the tongue of a child, meaning thereby that he had been able to express the highest truths of philosophy in language which a child could understand." Unquote. The text referenced is Locke's posthumously published Of the Conduct of the Understanding, 1706, which espoused the importance of rational self-examination and its virtues. In his speech at the Sanskrit College Hall, Dokinaranjan had presented first a brief summary of the history of India, and in the process had also specifically attempted to historicize and criticize the phenomenon of caste. Young Bengal had been militating against caste discrimination in both writing and action. The deliberate public infringement of dietary restrictions of caste was legendary. The infamous incident of beef eating and throwing of the bones into a Brahmin's house in 1831 being only one instance among many others, as I've shown elsewhere. We can therefore be sure that when Dokinaranjan mentioned the distinction of caste and religious sectarianism as the ultimate evils among the Hindus in this speech on the completely unrelated subject of the police and judiciary, he was doing so deliberately and with full intent to reiterate a stated position on the matter. He said in a long sentence full of passion and many subclauses, I'm warning you, quote, "The Muslims found the Hindu race enslaved and buried in the vices of an overwhelming superstition that, impiously endeavoring to subvert the just ordinance of the Almighty, who in his impartial wisdom created all men alike equal to one another in their birthrights, instituted the unnatural and unholy distinction of caste in the place of natural equality and perfect freedom, and sowed thereby the seeds of division, alienation, disorder, and anarchy throughout Hindustan, dissevering the joint and aggregate interests of the Commonwealth into separate and jarring elements connected with rivalry of clanship and the hostility of religious sectarianism, to which our country has been more or less a prey in the course of successive eras, and which were first introduced by an ambitious and domineering priesthood, and subsequently upheld and sanctified by ignorance and error, tending to stultify human reason, lest it should remind men of their right to think for themselves and to strip them of their physical strength, lest they should be able to assert their native dignity." All of that was one sentence. From phrases such as impiously endeavoring to subvert the just ordinance of the Almighty, we can see, of course, that the rhetoric against caste was infected with the language of Christianity as it was preached in the city at the time. The use of it could also be politic. He may have been doing so in order to appeal to the wider British constituency who would be reading the speech in the Hurkaru the next day, and in whose hands lay the power to act upon its accusations. More significant, however, is the validation of human reason and the right to think for themselves as principles that should animate all Indians, as is the reference to the joint and aggregate interests of the Commonwealth. In his two treatises on government, Locke had written, I quote, "In political society, liberty consists of being under no other lawmaking power except that established by consent in the Commonwealth. People are free from the dominion of any will or legal restraint apart from that enacted by their own constituted lawmaking power according to the trust put in it," unquote. Phrases such as natural equality and perfect freedom, which was also a phrase Dakshinaranjan had used, seem also to reference Locke's two treatises, where Locke had defended the argument that, again, I'm quoting the relevant portion, "Men are by nature free and equal against claims that God has made all people naturally subject to a monarch," arguing that people have rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and property, that have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society, unquote. Locke's claim that men are naturally free and equal was part of the justification for understanding legitimate political government as the result of a social contract where people in the state of nature conditionally transfer some of their rights to the government in order to better ensure the stable, comfortable enjoyment of their lives, liberty, and property. Since governments exist by the consent of the people in order to protect the rights of the people and promote the public good, governments that fail to do so can be resisted and replaced by new governments, unquote. This understanding underpinned almost exactly Dakshinaranjan's claim in his speech on the police and judiciary, judged treasonous by Richardson, that the current rulers were on a lease and should be replaced if unable to address the grievances and common good of the people themselves. Although he characterized the previous Muslim rulers as marauders in the following sentence of the speech, Dakshinaranjan went on to say that, quote, "Yet by these conquerors, the forms of justice at least were preserved. For unlike the British, quote again, during successive stages of the progress of civil polity, they bore testimony to the necessity which the most depraved of princes had felt of maintaining at least an outward observance of respect. This was a sure, though imperfect, recognition of the rights of the government," unquote. Meanwhile, in 1841, 2 years before Dakshinaranjan's speech in the Sanskrit College Hall, the theoretical premises of political liberty had been dealt with in detail in the first meeting of a new association called the Desh Hitoishini Sabha, where Sharada Prasad Ghosh, headmaster and headmaster of a local school and a pupil of Derozio, had given a speech in October 1841 that had been read out in Bengali to the large number of people assembled there. In that speech, he had begun by emphatically asserting that, I quote, "Our deprivation of the enjoyment of political liberty is the cause of our misery and degradation. The losses of happiness follow the losses of civil liberty as shadow does the substance. This is a principle which has been received as an axiom of political science." One of the chief objections to British rule in India was spelled out by him here as residing in the despotism practiced upon millions by an autocratic few. I quote, "The administration of the supreme government of this country has a few years hence been entrusted to the hands of 6 gentlemen who compose the Council of India. These gentlemen enact laws for the government of millions of human beings without taking their opinion to the tendency of those laws which purport to be conducive to their welfare. And hence is the reason that we are so often governed by laws which have a pernicious tendency to occasion and perpetuate our political degradation." The argument that the opinion of the people is necessary in the making of laws is made here for perhaps again the first time on behalf of India and Indians, with the help of examples from history to illustrate why our present rulers, the British, would never ever, quote, "enable us to rise in the scale of political greatness." We have had no hand in the constitution of this country, Sharada Prasad reminds his audience, and political greatness would never be achieved without that. He then gives us a series of historical examples. The first of this pertains to Britain itself. We say that the people of England enjoy political liberty to the fullest extent. It may naturally be asked, from what time can that enjoyment of that liberty be dated? To this query, it must be answered from the very time the House of Commons, which represent the bulk of the people of England, has had a hand in the enactment of laws relative to the management of the affairs of the nation. From this, it becomes evident that a country cannot possibly occupy a prominent station in the scale of political greatness unless its people possess a share in the administration of its government. Political liberty can only be attained through representative government. Surely this is the first instance in which an Indian is attempting to explain this to his audience in their own language. The second example is from the Roman Empire, not surprisingly. When did the Roman Empire begin to rise? At the time the government of the Roman began to assume a regular form. When did it make rapid progress? At the time the greater body of the people enjoyed political rights and privileges. When did it fall down at once? At the time a chaotic confusion prevailed in the constitution of the nation and the mass of the people lost their civil liberty. Does not this example alone tend to prove the truth of my assertion that the misery and degradation of the people are to be dated from the moment they lose their political and civil liberty? The greatest political activist of the preceding decade in Calcutta, Ram Mohan Roy, had expressed no such democratic thought, however embryonic its conception, that a country attains greatness only when the greater body of the people enjoy political rights and privileges. 18th century intellectual that Ram Mohan was, he would not have envisaged that the peaceful and happy constitution of a nation was coeval with the mass of people enjoying their civil liberty. Sharada Prasad, on the other hand, is clear that the solution to the problem in 1841 lay in the giving of political rights and privileges to the greater body of the people of India. Nonetheless, it must be understood that these political rights and privileges do not mean freedom from British rule. And the course of action is accordingly envisaged with an equal amount of clear-headed projection towards the end of his speech. He said, "You do not, like the brave and noble-minded Americans, aspire so high as to free yourselves from the yoke of the British sway, to take in your own hands the reins of government and to display in the world striking instances of your courage exerted in the cause of your independence. No, your aspiration is by far much humbler. You only desire that you may be freed from the tyranny and oppression of the local government of this country, and that consequently consequently a salutary change may be effected in your present degraded condition." To be disappointed at so tame a conclusion to so fiery a speech would be a historical anomaly. Yet that is what most historians of the period have done till date, if they have noticed this speech at all. What needs to be noted rather is that in principle, the cause of your independence is acknowledged here as the ultimate goal for all patriots. And to take in your own hands the reins of government spelt out as the final aim for all Indians. To object to it being merely a theoretical premise would be a disservice to the men who were envisioning a future still too remote to be achieved. The importance of working toward a better future for the people from their present degraded condition should not be belittled, nor the significance of attempting to be rid of the tyranny and oppression of the local government of this country, that is, East India Company rule. John Stuart Mill's discussion of political liberty and non-liberty 18 years after Sharada Prasad had similarly brought up the situation in the ancient European past. There are various, the next section, I'm now getting a little worried about time. So the following page or so basically quotes from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty to show how some of the things discussed in that book were in fact discussed in principle in this speech by Sharada Prasad. The context of Europe too is similar to the two speeches, to the speech and to the book that followed. Despotism was therefore fought against by Young Bengal on two fronts. At first, the rebellion of Young Bengal most prominently involved social rebellion. And this is, of course, not something I've addressed in this talk. It's something I've addressed in the book in a previous chapter. This social rebellion of Young Bengal involved the attacking of orthodoxy, caste rules, and Brahminical oppression. In doing all of this, they were acting on the principles that were the subject of On Liberty, which was about individual independence, or how to make the fitting adjustment between individual independence and social control, unquote. Now, in 1843, it was pressing ahead hard on another front, arguing against political despotism and urging political reform. Freedom of opinion or free discussion of thought, Mill thought none of these were applicable to Indians, though as the plethora of societies, discussion groups, and associations in Bengal between 1830 to 1840 attest, the civil sphere in Calcutta certainly did not inhabit a time, and this quotation from Mill is about the time when this is not applicable, a time, quote, anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. If the numbers involved in such a discussion be the issue, it would be well to consider a comparison with the numbers in England itself, which would no doubt show that there too the number of philosophic radicals were proportionately minuscule in comparison with the general population, which was often unlettered, disadvantaged, and largely without a vote. Mill had no interest in knowing that his theorization of individuality, especially individuality in the face of the despotism of the traditions and customs of their community as a whole, as well as of political liberty, especially its attainment under despotism, was being argued for, as he wrote his book, by a generation of Indian contemporaries. If he had met Thomson upon his return to England from Calcutta in 1844, things may have been different. But just as James Mill had not bothered to consult either Hastings or Francis when he wrote his account of the trial of Warren Hastings, relying instead on parliamentary reports and impeachment proceedings alone, so too John Stuart Mill had no interest in or knowledge of British India in his own time as it existed at the end of a ship's journey to the shores of its capital city. The last concluding section is called the Bengal British India Society, Faujdari Balakhana, Calcutta. The argument for freedom of speech and freedom from abuses of power by despotic governments made so powerfully in the hall of the Sanskrit College had a significant outcome politically. Outraged at this interference at their rights, the meeting concluded that day with Dakshinaranjan expressing the opinion that after what has occurred, it will be impossible to continue our meetings in this hall, and we must go where we shall not be at the mercy of a single individual. Purkaru reported that, I quote, Babu Kalachand Seth expressed his concurrence in the sentiments of the essay and the remarks just made and approved the conduct of the chairman. Captain Richardson said he regretted having said anything calculated to hurt the feelings of those present and retracted what he had said. It, however, appeared to be, and this is emphasized, the unanimous feeling of the members to discontinue the meetings at the hall and to hold them elsewhere. The search now began for a new premises of the SAGK meetings. Not an easy task given the urgency of the matter, and it took almost a month for the venue to shift from 6 March 1843 to the hall above the dispensary at number 31, Faujdari Wala. There were about 20 members of the SAGK from the Medical College, Calcutta, then newly established as the first of its kind in Asia in 1835. And some of them came forward now to offer this venue in central Kolkata, which still stands, by the way, at the junction of Rabindra Saroni and Kulutola Street. I'll show you an image if I can, where the group then relocated. Once it was decided that the meetings would not be held in government premises any longer, this fraternity, the medical fraternity, stepped in to provide material help. The Hulkadu reported that the venue at number 31 Faujdari Balakhana had been arranged for by Dr. D. Gupta and Dr. Gaurishankar Mitter of Gupta and Mitter, who had their dispensary located in the lower flat of the premises. Dharapana Gupta, this is just an aside, but it's so interesting, or D. Gupta, was a pupil of Roshi Krishna Mundik's, one of the original Young Bengal, and a protege of Hare's. One of the 4 founding students of the Calcutta Medical College, he assisted Madhusudan Gupta in the first human dissection undertaken by an Asian in 1836. His career path was very similar to Tarachand and Ram Gopal's, and emblematic of Young Bengal, in that he refused an offer of employment as medical officer by the EIC to strike out on his own, setting up his own firm, Messrs. D. Gupta and Company, the first dispensary owned by a Bengali, in 1840, going on to export his famous patented anti-periodic mixture for malarial and other fevers, even to Africa. The premises at number 31 Faujdari Balakhana seem to have hosted 5 meetings in all until the 28th of April, 1843. The meeting has been described. So I couldn't resist also just giving you a very vivid description of what it was like when these meetings were being held at the Faujdari Balakhana in Calcutta at that time. It was reported that the building was densely crowded. Audience was composed mainly of gentlemen representing all sections of the native community. A number of Europeans were also present. But then a very interesting semi-fictional account was published in the papers by someone signing in as J.M. And the piece was titled The Young Babu. A crowd of Babus, chiefly young ones, assembled where above and below remedies are dispensed for all the ills that flesh or the state is heir to, even the Faujdari Balakhana in Chitpur Road. The meeting was held in the upper story where the political physic is dispensed. The rights and wrongs of India, the disorders of the government and the complaints of the government, with the remedies to be supplied, were the subjects of its consideration. Mr. George Thompson, for he was there, an honored visitor, had been unusually brilliant on the subject. Several patriotic babus had electrified the meeting, and the utmost enthusiasm was manifested in applauding and hearing. The appearance of a fictional young man is then described, providing us with a rare visual description from the British side of the men who comprised Young Bengal. I quote, "A young man of modest mien arose to address the assembly. He was a smallish, well-shaped youth with regular features, large, softly brilliant eyes, and a small moustache. His dress was the usual closely fitting white muslin upper garment or surcoat, reaching from neck to ankle, with a white scarf hanging gracefully over one shoulder." Yeah, lampooned by Hutum in Hutum Pechan Naksha, if you remember. The 2 extremities of the man, the head and the feet, were respectively covered by a neatly folded white turban and a pair of Europe fashion shoes. It was here at number 31 Faujdari Balakhana on the 20th of April 1843 that the first political party formed in India, the Bengal British India Society, came into existence. Rarely acknowledged as such, with that honor traditionally bestowed either on the Landholders Society or on the British Indian Association, formed in 1851, this nevertheless was the progenitor of all the Indian political associations that followed it. It can be seen from a close examination of the formation of the society that it fundamentally established, in fact, a political party that inaugurated the method and manner of modern political agitation as it existed throughout the 19th century in India. Although no stranger to societies of every hue, what the city witnessed for the first time with the foundation of the Bengal British India Society was a society founded on the principles of a political party. In some ways, in fact, the rhetoric on record at the Bengal British India Society was more radical than other subsequent bodies, even while it first put into place the objectives stated by the British Indian Association later to secure improvements in the local administration of the country and in the system of government laid down by Parliament. It also initiated exactly those concerns subsequently espoused by all political groupings in the 19th century when it wished to remove existing defects in the laws and civil administration of the country and to promote the greater welfare of all Indians. Thank you so much. I don't think I've actually exceeded time because there were interruptions for all of this.
Thank you so much. এটা কিন্তু ক্রস মতন করা কিছু অন